The year is 37 CE. Rome stands at the height of its power, controlling territories from Britain to the deserts of North Africa. In March of that year, a young man named Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus becomes emperor at just 24 years old. The Roman people celebrate. They have no idea what is coming. History knows him as Caligula, Little Boot, a childhood nickname given by soldiers who adored him as a boy. Within 4 years, that same name would become synonymous with madness, cruelty, and the darkest possibilities of absolute power. But the story of Caligula is not simply a tale of one man's depravity. It is a case study in what happens when unlimited authority meets a troubled mind, when political institutions fail to constrain individual excess, and when an entire society becomes complicit in atrocity through silence and fear. To understand what Caligula became, we must first understand where he came from. He was born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, Rome's first imperial family, a family already marked by political violence, suspicious deaths, and dangerous concentrations of power. His father, Germanicus, was Rome's most beloved general, a military hero whose popularity threatened the reigning emperor Tiberius. When Germanicus died suddenly in 19 CE, possibly poisoned the 7-year-old, Caligula lost not only his father but his family's protection. His mother Agrippina and his brothers were systematically destroyed by Tiberius through exile, imprisonment, and orchestrated death. Caligula survived by becoming invisible, by learning to hide his thoughts, by mastering the art of pleasing dangerous men. He spent his teenage years in the company of Tiberius on the island of Capri, witnessing firsthand the paranoia and cruelty of absolute power exercised by an aging emperor who trusted no one. The ancient historian Suetonius would later write that no better slave or worse master ever existed than Caligula. This observation captures something essential. The young man who became emperor had spent his entire life either as a victim of imperial power or as a careful observer of its exercise. He had never known normal human relationships, never experienced constraints that applied equally to everyone, never learned that some boundaries exist for good reason. When Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, Rome genuinely rejoiced. The new emperor was young, handsome, connected to the beloved Germanicus. He began his reign with acts of apparent generosity, recalling exiles, reducing taxes, hosting spectacular games. For 7 months, everything seemed promising. Then Caligula fell seriously ill. The exact nature of this illness remains debated by historians. Some ancient sources suggest epilepsy. Others point to encephalitis or brain fever. Modern scholars have proposed everything from viral infection to psychological breakdown triggered by stress. What matters is not the medical diagnosis but the change that followed. When Caligula recovered, he was fundamentally altered. Their transformation might have been neurological brain damage from fever or infection affecting judgment and impulse control. It might have been psychological, a mind that finally broke under decades of trauma and fear. Or it might have been something more calculated, a conscious decision by a young man who suddenly understood that no force in the known world could stop him from doing whatever he wished. What followed was a systematic exploration of power's absolute limits. Caligula began testing boundaries, small violations at first, then larger ones, discovering with apparent fascination that each transgression brought no consequences except those he himself decreed. He elevated his favorite horse Incitatus to positions of honor, making the animal a priest and reportedly planning to make him consul, not from madness, but as deliberate mockery of the Senate's dignity. He declared himself a living god and demanded worship, constructing a temple to his own divinity and forcing senators to serve as his priests. This was not mere megalomania. In a polytheistic society where the line between exceptional humans and minor deities was already blurred, Caligula was pushing existing concepts to their logical extreme while simultaneously making it clear that he considered himself above all human law. The financial reality of Caligula's reign reveals another dimension of his rule. His predecessor Tiberius had accumulated vast imperial reserves through careful management. Caligula spent them within 2 years on construction projects, games, gifts, and personal extravagances. His solution to the resulting crisis was to invent new forms of taxation and confiscation, targeting Rome's wealthy families through accusations of conspiracy or disloyalty. Estates were seized, fortunes transferred to the imperial treasury, creating a climate of terror where wealth itself became dangerous. Ancient sources describe Caligula's financial methods with consistent details across multiple authors. He would attend dinners at the homes of wealthy Romans, openly admiring their possessions while the terrified hosts wondered whether compliments were preludes to confiscation. He established taxes on everything from prostitution to lawsuits, treating the empire's economy as his personal resource to be exploited without limit. He reportedly reviewed and randomly revised wills, enriching himself from the estates of the deceased. The real horror of Caligula's reign lay not in isolated acts of violence. Rome had seen cruel emperors before, but in the systematic way he weaponized power to violate every social boundary that made civilization possible. The ancient historian Suetonius, writing decades after Caligula's death, documented behaviors that modern historians have spent centuries trying to verify or contextualize. According to multiple ancient sources, Caligula's relationship with his sister Drusilla crossed boundaries that Roman society considered absolute violations. When Drusilla died in 38 CE, possibly from fever, Caligula's response was extreme even by imperial standards. He declared her a goddess unprecedented for a woman and made it a capital crime to show any sign of normalcy on the anniversary of her death. Citizens were forbidden from laughing, bathing, or dining with family on that date, transforming private grief into mandatory public performance. The relationship between historical truth and propaganda becomes particularly complex with Caligula. Ancient sources were written by his enemies or by authors working for emperors who needed to justify his assassination. They had strong motives to exaggerate his crimes, yet archaeological evidence discovered in the 20th century has confirmed details that historians once dismissed as impossible fabrication. In the 1930s, Mussolini ordered Lake Nemi drained to recover the massive pleasure barges that ancient sources claimed Caligula had built. What emerged from the mud was extraordinary. Two enormous ships, the larger measuring over 230 feet in length, featuring heated floors, running water systems, and marble decorations. These were vessels whose scale and luxury exceeded even what ancient descriptions had claimed. They were not designed for travel across the small lake, but as floating venues for gatherings that needed to remain hidden from shore observers. What happened on those ships remains partly speculation because ancient authors described events in carefully vague terms. What is clear is that senators and their families were summoned to attend, that refusal carried deadly consequences, and that attendees were required to participate in activities that violated Roman moral and legal codes. The senator Valerius Catullus reportedly chose suicide after one such gathering rather than accept further invitations. Perhaps most disturbing was Caligula's establishment of what sources describe as a brothel within the imperial palace itself. Staffed by conscripted members of noble Roman families, multiple ancient authors mention this independently, with consistent details. Families were informed that their members had been selected for service to the emperor. Fees went directly to the imperial treasury. A price list was allegedly posted at the palace entrance, with rates varying according to family prestige. This was not impulsive cruelty but organized revenue generation using human degradation as commodity. The practice of claiming bride rights at weddings of Roman nobles appears in several ancient accounts with specific examples. When a nobleman named Gaius Piso married Livia Orestilla in 37 CE, Caligula attended the ceremony, then announced his intention to take the bride himself. He divorced the couple by imperial decree, married Livia himself, and discarded her within months. Similar incidents are recorded with other families. This practice served multiple purposes beyond personal gratification. It demonstrated that no relationship in Rome was secure and created terror that made political opposition nearly impossible. The scholarly debate about Caligula focuses on several key questions. How much of the ancient evidence reflects reality versus propaganda? To what extent was his behavior caused by mental illness versus calculated political terror? How should modern historians balance sensational ancient accounts against the need for evidence-based interpretation? What remains clear is that Caligula's reign represented a critical failure of Roman political institutions. The constitutional mechanisms meant to restrain imperial power proved completely inadequate when faced with someone willing to ignore all precedent. The Senate, which theoretically held authority, was reduced to terrified compliance. The Praetorian Guard, which could have intervened, was bought off with increased pay and privileges. The end came on January 24, 41, CE. A conspiracy of Praetorian officers, led by Cassius Sharia Guard, whom Caligula had repeatedly mocked and humiliated, assassinated the emperor in a palace corridor as he left the theater. The plotters killed not only Caligula but also his fourth wife Caesonia and their infant daughter, eliminating the entire immediate imperial family. Rome's reaction to Caligula's death tells us something important. There was no public mourning, no state funeral, no official deification. The Senate initially considered restoring the Republic, debating for hours whether the empire itself should be dissolved. That they ultimately chose to continue with imperial governance, electing Caligula's uncle Claudius as the next emperor, reveals how completely Rome had accepted that the Republic was finished. The historical legacy of Caligula extends beyond his individual crimes to larger questions about power itself. His reign demonstrated what becomes possible when authority becomes absolute, when institutional constraints fail, when fear replaces accountability. The Roman Empire would continue for centuries after his death, but it would never again pretend that emperors were merely first citizens rather than autocrats whose character determined millions of lives. Modern historians approach Caligula with appropriate caution, recognizing that ancient sources must be critically evaluated while acknowledging that archaeological and documentary evidence supports many of their claims. What emerges is not a simple monster but something more disturbing: a human being who discovered that unlimited power transforms morality itself, making anything possible and nothing forbidden. The story of Caligula reminds us that civilization depends not on the character of rulers but on systems that constrain them. Rome failed that test. The consequences of that failure echo across 2,000 years.